The function of tradition. So, the work of a poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with works of the past and judged by the standards of the past. But this judgment does not mean determining good or bad. It does not mean deciding whether the present work is better or worse than the works of the past. An author in the present is certainly not to be judged by the principles or standards of the past. The comparison is made for knowing the facts and all the facts about the new work of art. The comparison is made for the purposes of analysis, for forming a better understanding of the new. Moreover, this comparison is reciprocal. The past helps us to understand the present, and the present throws light on the past. It is in this way alone that we can form an idea of what is really individual and new. It is by comparison alone that we can sift the traditional from the individual elements in a given work of art. So, the function of tradition is to have an understanding of the work of art that you are, the literary work that you are reading. So, in a way, the past and the present feed off each other. The way we view the past is sort of shaped by our present, and the way our present is shaped is by the past. So, they feed off each other. And we need to have an understanding of the past to understand the present. And by having that understanding, we can sort of like sift the traditional, like we have a given piece of work, right, like a poem or whatever. By when we know the past, we can sort of identify the elements in that work which is coming from the traditional, from the ancients, and we can identify any originality or individuality. We can sort of separate those two in any given work of art. Now we move on to the sense of tradition, its real meaning. So Eliot now explains further what he means by a sense of tradition. The sense of tradition does not mean that the poet should try to know the past as a whole, take it to be a lump or a mass without any discrimination. So Eliot doesn't just want you to like know stuff for the sake of knowing, know your history, know everything just for the sake of it. And he also recognizes that it is impossible as well as undesirable to do so. You must only examine the past critically, and only the parts of it that are significant you should acquire. The sense of tradition does not also mean that the poet should know only a few poets whom he admires. So you should not just focus on the people, even the ancients that you like. Like if you like Homer, doesn't mean that you should only look at Homer. You need to look at the other people too, Virgil and whoever was there. Then if you do this, like if you focus just on one ancient person, and that according to Eliot is a sign of immaturity and inexperience. Neither should a poet be content merely to know some particular age or period which he or she likes. This may be pleasant and delightful, but it will not constitute a sense of tradition. A sense of tradition, in the real sense, means a consciousness of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably to the most distinguished reputations. Let's take that again. A sense of tradition, in the real sense, means a consciousness of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably to the most distinguished reputations. So he's saying that it's like a sort of a very, I don't know, it feels like he's talking about something that's really sublime. Like you should just know stuff, just know it. Like it's intuition. It's like very intrinsic to your personality to be able to just sense what is the current carrying in, and what's the most, like the juiciest parts of everything, just being able to like gather up that. In other words, to know the tradition, the poet must judge critically what are the main trends and what are not. So you have to have a feel for what is hot and what's not. He must confine himself to the main trends to the exclusion of all that is incidental or topical. The poet must possess the critical gift in ample measure. There it is. The poet must possess the critical gift in ample measure. So here this is something that's supposed to be into like something that you must just have. He must also realize that the main literary trends are not determined by the great poets alone. Smaller poets are also significant. They are not to be ignored. So he sort of slightly contradicts himself here. He's just saying you need to have a feel of what's really hot and what's not. You should gather the main juiciest parts so that you can get a feel of what's going to be grand, so that you can be a great poet. But at the same time, he's like, you know what, like if smaller poets are there, they're not also totally insignificant. Don't ignore everything that's insignificant, or you think so. He's sort of like really a little bit confusing here. Okay, then next we move on to works of art and their permanence. The poet must also realize that art never improves, though its material is never the same. The mind of Europe may change, but this change does not mean that great writers like Shakespeare and Homer have grown outdated and lose their significance. I actually wonder about that. But okay, anyway, the great works of art never lose their significance, for there is no qualitative improvement in art. There may be refinement, there may be development, but from the point of view of the artist, there is no improvement. For example, it will not be correct to say that the art of Shakespeare is better and higher than that of Eliot. Their works are of different kinds, for the material on which they worked was different. Okay, so according to Eliot, art never improves. Its material, although its material is never the same. So he's saying there may be refinement, there may be development, but from the point of the view of the artist, absolutely no improvement. So you can't say something is higher or better than something else. Very difficult to make a judgment then, but okay. Now moving on, awareness of the poet's duty to acquire it. So T.S. Eliot is conscious of the criticism that will be made of his theory of tradition. His view of tradition requires, it will be said, a ridiculous amount of erudition. Okay, I think his theory of tradition, I mean, just looking at it, it seems a bit flowery and stuff. So it will be pointed out that there have been great poets who were not learned, and further that too much learning kills sensibility. However, knowledge does not merely mean bookish knowledge, and the capacity for acquiring knowledge differs from person to person. Some can absorb knowledge easily, while others must sweat for it. Shakespeare, for example, could know more of Roman history from Plutarch than more men can from the British Museum. It is the duty of every poet to acquire, to the best of his ability, this knowledge of the past, and he must continue to acquire this consciousness throughout his career. Such awareness of tradition sharpens poetic creation. So awareness of the past is a poet's duty, according to Eliot, and Eliot also recognizes that there are some criticisms that will be made of his tradition, of his views of tradition, because it requires a lot of effort to be that learned about the past, and and there are examples of poets who are not that. There are examples of writers who really don't pay that much attention to I guess to the like technical parts, but still they manage to make works of art that are great, and also too much knowledge, all work and no play can make Jack a dull boy kind of a thing. So too much bookish knowledge might actually just kill your creativity. Too much fact in your brain maybe. And also the capacity for acquiring knowledge differs from person to person, but Eliot says that even so, it's the duty of every poet to acquire, to the best of his ability, knowledge of the past, and he should continue to gather this consciousness throughout his career, because it would sharpen his poetic creation. Okay, fine. So moving on, we will go to his theory of impersonality of poetry. So here Eliot says that the artist must continuously surrender himself to something which is more valuable than himself. That is the literary tradition. He must allow his poetic sensibility to be shaped and modified by the past. He must continue to acquire the sense of tradition throughout his career. In the beginning, his individuality may assert itself. But as his powers mature, there must be greater and greater extinction of his personality. Interesting. This reminds me of like Saitama or something, it's like an anime. So here he says that, as your powers as a poet increase, your personality should get more and more extinct from your poetries. Nice. So he must acquire greater and greater objectivity. His emotions and passions must be depersonalized. He must be as impersonal, as objective as a scientist. Should he be a sociopath? The personality of an artist is not important. The important thing is his sense of tradition. A good poem is a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. He must forget his personal joys and sorrows, and be absorbed in acquiring a sense of tradition and expressing it in his poetry. This is all really very a good poem. Yeah, he must forget. So yeah, he should just forget about himself and create poetry. He should be like a machine for making poetry and creating literature. Thus, the poet's personality is merely a medium having the same significance as a catalytic agent or a receptacle in which chemical reactions take place. That is why Eliot holds that honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. I feel like Eliot's, like, this is a bit personal for Eliot. Like, he thought that, I don't know why, I feel like he didn't want to he didn't want to be attacked by other poets, maybe, so this is his way of, like, deflecting, maybe, who knows. Because then you can say, oh, the poem is shitty, not the poet. The poet is fine, the poem is shitty. Maybe he didn't lose his sense of self entirely yet. Anyway, the poetic process, that's here, the analogy of the catalyst. In the second part of the essay, Eliot develops further his theory of the impersonality of poetry. He compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst and the process of poetic creation. So he's saying this brain of the poet is just the catalyst, and the process of poetic creation, he says it's like a freaking chemical reaction, I guess. Okay, so the brain of the poet is just a catalyst, and that's just a chemical reaction. Okay, so just as chemical reactions take place in the presence of a catalyst alone, so the poet's mind is the catalytic agent for combining different emotions into something new. Suppose there is a jar containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. These two gases combine to form sulfurous acid with a fine filament of platinum when a fine filament of platinum is introduced into a jar. The combination takes place only in the presence of this platinum, but the metal itself does not undergo any change. Like when you add Eno in water, sort of like that. I said the water is just there, but when you add Eno, there's a chemical reaction, and then there are bubbles, and it tastes really good, and you enjoy it, stuff like that. So it remains inert, neutral, and unaffected. The mind of the poet is like the catalytic agent. It is necessary for new combinations of emotions and experiences to take place, but it itself does not undergo any changes during the process of poetic combination. The mind of the poet is constantly forming emotions and experiences into new wholes, but then like the mind of the poet could be like, one day your mind could be like a Coke, and then you can add a Mentos into it, and then boom, you get Coke and Mentos. Another day you can your mind as a poet can be water, and you can add Eno into it, boom, you have another tasty drink. Just as the newly formed sulfurous acid does not contain any trace of platinum. In the case of a young and immature poet, his mind, his personal emotions and experiences may find some expression in his composition. But, says Eliot, the more perfect artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. So the man who suffers and the mind which creates are totally separate. So the more perfect you are as a poet, as an artist, the more separate will be your pain and your work. You will experience your pain, but you will be detached from it in order to create your work of art. Nice. The test of maturity of which form the substance of his poetry, the man suffers, that is, has experiences, but it is his mind which transforms his experiences into something new and different. The personality of the poet does not find expression in his poetry. It acts like a catalytic age. That word, catalytic agent in the process of poetic composition. Moving on, emotions and feelings. The experiences which enter the poetic process, says Eliot, may be of two kinds. They are emotions and feelings. Okay. So first of all, when the poet is making the poem, that's the poetic process, and there are two kinds of things that go on here. One is emotions, the other is feelings. So poetry may be composed out of emotions only, or out of feelings only, or of both. So there are three combinations that you can have here. Either you can have just emotions, either just feelings, or you can have both of them together. So T.S. Eliot here distinguishes between emotions and feelings, but he does not state what this difference is. Nowhere else in his writings, says A.G. George, is this distinction maintained. Neither does he adequately distinguish between the meaning of the two words. The distinction should therefore be ignored, more so as it has no bearing on his impersonal theory of poetry. So although he gives some idea of it, he doesn't really state the difference, so we can't really take his word for it. Yeah, okay. So moving on, poetry as organization, intensity of the poetic process. So now Eliot says the poet's mind, he takes the poet's mind, compares it to a jar or a receptacle. So he says your mind as a poet is like this jar or receptacle in which are stored numberless feelings. So here we have feelings, emotions and stuff. Okay, so we have feelings and emotions and stuff inside that jar, and they remain there in an unorganized and chaotic form till, so it's like a slurry in there, till all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. All the particles which can untie to form a new compound are present together. Okay, so all these things are present there in a slurry, feelings, emotions are all there until some compound is come and put in this, which separates them all. All of them are separated because of that thing. Okay, so thus poetry is organization rather than inspiration. Whew. Yeah, I think I made a mistake there. Okay, so all the things are there mixed here in this slurry, and then a compound is put here, and all of this becomes a totally new compound, and that's the final work of art or the poem. Okay, anyway, thus poetry is organization rather than inspiration, and the greatness of a poem does not. I feel like S Eliot took one class in chemistry, and this was what he wrote after that. Like, oh, I'm a poet who knows chemistry. Forgive me for my ignorance, but moving on. And the greatness of a poem does not depend upon the greatness or even the intensity of the emotions, which are the components of the poem, but the intensity of the process of poetic composition. Okay, so the process of making the poem is what is more important rather than just the poem. Okay, so just as a chemical reaction takes place under pressure, so also intensity is needed for the fusion of emotions. The more intense the poetic process, the greater the poem. Yeah, fine. There is always a difference between the artistic emotion and the personal emotions of the poet. For example, the famous Ode to Nightingale of Keats contains a number of emotions which have nothing to do with Nightingale. The difference between art and the event is always absolute. The poet has no personality to express, he is merely a medium in which impressions and experiences combine in a peculiar and unexpected way. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may find no place in his poetry, and those which become important in the poetry have no significance for the man. Eliot thus rejects romantic subjectivism. Okay, so he's saying, okay, he says three things here. First is that, like the chemical reaction that takes place, like first is a slurry of emotions in the pot, you put a compound in, and suddenly everything makes a different compound altogether. Another thing is that the process through which you write the poem is more important than the final work of art. The difference between art and the event is always absolute. The poet here has, a truly great poet has, according to Eliot of course, expresses no personality, he's just a medium, and impressions and experiences combine, and then you have the work of art, but then you don't really see the person in that, so there's no reflection of the poet. We get that. So whatever is important to the poet, to the man, is not important or doesn't even show up in the poem. So there should be a stark line between being a poet and being a human being, with all your feelings and stuff. So whatever problems you have in your life, it should not spill over into your poetry, basically. Whatever you are should not reflect in your poetry. Anyway, so moving on to artistic emotion, the value of concentration. The emotion of poetry, it's different from the personal emotions of the poet. His personal emotions may be simple or crude, but the emotion of his poetry may be complex and refined. It is a mistaken notion that the poet must express new emotions that result in much eccentricity in poetry. It is not the business of the poet to find new emotions. Something tells me that T.S. Eliot might not like Kubla Khan, or did he write that? No, he didn't. Okay, he may only express ordinary emotions, but he must impart to them a new significance and a new meaning. And it is not necessary that they should be his personal emotions. Even emotions which he has never personally experienced can serve the purpose of poetry. For example, emotions which result from the reading of books can serve his turn. Eliot rejects Wordsworth's theory of poetry having its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility, and points out that the process of poetic composition, there is neither emotion nor recollection nor tranquility. In the poetic process, there is only concentration of a number of experiences, and a new thing results from this concentration. And this process of concentration is neither conscious nor deliberate, it is a passive one. There is no doubt that there are elements in the poetic process which are conscious and deliberate. The difference between a good and a bad poet is that a bad poet is conscious when he should be unconscious, and unconscious when he should be, oh my god, conscious. It is this consciousness of the wrong kind which makes a poem personal. whereas mature art must be impersonal. But Eliot does not tell us when a poet should be conscious and when not. The point has been left vague and indeterminate. So, in this whole artistic emotion, the value of concentration, Eliot confuses you. He tells you that, your emotions may be simple or crude, but your poems must be complex and defined. So, you don't have to really express new emotions. I mean, if you're a poet, hypothetically, if you are a poet. So, it's not it's not your job to find new emotions. You just have to express ordinary ones, but to them you must give a new significance and a new meaning. And yeah, you can even like put in emotions that you've never personally experienced to serve the purpose of your poetry. And yeah, he's also saying that he doesn't really like, he sort of rejects Wordsworth. He doesn't really believe in, emotions recollected in tranquility and daffodils and like tigers and sheep or whatever. And he thinks that that process that Wordsworth liked, right? Wordsworth was what, recollection of strong emotions in tranquility, stuff like that. He doesn't feel that it's like that. He feels that there's only concentration. So the poet, so you as a poet would experience a number of experiences, and from that, you will unconsciously, create a poem or a work of art. Um, okay, he says the difference between a good and a bad poet is that a bad poet is conscious when he should be unconscious, and unconscious when he should be conscious. Okay, so you're paying attention when you shouldn't be paying attention, and you're sort of like goofing off when you should be paying attention, sort of like that. So, and it's this consciousness of the wrong kind which makes a poem personal, whereas mature art must be impersonal. So maybe you're focusing on the wrong emotions, you're focusing on things that you shouldn't focus on, which is making your art personal, and that is what Eliot doesn't like. He wants the art to be personal because according to him, mature art is impersonal. It has nothing to do with you, it's totally separate. I personally don't agree with this, but that's just Eliot. Anyway, poetry as an escape from personality and personal emotions. The poet concludes, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion but an escape from emotion. It is not an expression of personality but an escape from personality. Thus, Eliot does not deny personality or emotion to the poet, only he must depersonalize his emotions. There should be an extinction of his personality. This impersonality can be achieved only when poet surrenders himself completely to the work that is to be done. And the poet can know what is to be done only if he acquires a sense of tradition, the historic sense which makes him conscious not only of the present, but of the present moment of the past, not only of what is dead, but of what is already living. So that's the end of this. To summarize, we know that Eliot, as a critic, this was one of his best works, I'm assuming. He wrote it in a long time ago. When was that? So he wrote it in 1919, or it was published that time. It has 3 parts. The first part gives us his concept of tradition. So he feels that looking at the past and having, basically the crux of his whole book is that we must look at the past and at the present, and as a poet it is your duty to be knowledgeable about all these things. It is your duty to have that knowledge in order to know your place in the current timeline, in order to fit your work in better, in order to produce better work. You must commit to having that knowledge. He believes that there is a certain type of skill that goes on there. He doesn't think that it is like, he thinks that it's more objective in the way that the poetic process, he compares it, like he tries to make it a bit scientific, comparing it to the chemical reactions and stuff. And he says that it's a lot of work, but at the same time he confuses you by saying that it's sort of something that should come to you a bit as intrinsically, like you just know when you know, kind of a thing. And he doesn't really give like clear cut concepts. He just gives you this really vague and broad ideas to work with, broad concepts to work with. But overall, what he does say does make sense. He says that we have a relationship with the past, and we should value that relationship by getting to know it. And I agree with that part of what he is saying. Yeah, so